everyone, it's Professor Nin here, and welcome to my lecture on Our Lady of Lavang, who I've been researching for quite some time. I would say, 15 years or almost 15 years, along with several other religions among the Vietnamese diaspora. So Our Lady of Lavang is part of the Catholic community. So here, the title of my presentation is Refugees and Resistance, Our Lady of Lavang and the Vietnamese Catholic Diaspora. So this is how Our Lady of Lavang looks like. I'm not sure how many of you guys have seen her, but she is quite global and well-known in certain ways. And hopefully, by the end of this presentation, I'll convince you that she is quite important. Not just for Vietnamese Catholics, but for our ways of understanding immigration, ethnic groups, particularly refugees, in relations to, of course, religious practices and beliefs. So the way in which I frame my studies is within, first of all, immigration studies. So here I'm showing you different models of adaptation. So green is being part of the mainstream society, and the different colors are representing different minority groups. And so assimilation, as you can see here, that means that the minority groups have blended in with the mainstream society. Whereas inclusion is when they're part of the mainstream society, but still retain their own uniqueness, whether it's cultural, religious, or any other forms of practices that makes them different, but also as a minority. Exclusion is when they're not even part of the mainstream society. They're excluded from full participation, as you can see here visually. Segregation is when a minority community form its own society, in a way, its own group, while coexisting with the mainstream society, being segregated from it. Integrated is when this community is, the minority community is still existing within its own niche, but that niche is within the mainstream society. So my research aims to understand, with the presence of Our Lady of Lavang among within Vietnamese diaspora, how does that reflect their adaptation to their whole societies, right? Whether it's the United States or other countries in which there are presence of Vietnamese Catholic communities. My theoretical frameworks is also in conversation with diaspora studies. So diaspora studies basically look at the ways in which minority communities are connected globally. So an example of that would be, for example, the Jewish community, Palestinian community, Chinese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, and so on, where in which they are, of course, situated within a national context, but at the same time, they have ties to their co-ethnic in other countries. So in my case, studying Vietnamese refugees within its own diaspora, so I'm talking about co-ethnic, right, maintaining tie to other Vietnamese in other countries, but as well as co-religionist, meaning Catholics, Vietnamese Catholics in other countries. So I want to see how they adapt locally, but also have this global orientation at the same time. My research also engaged with critical race studies, which try to look at how race intersect with cultural practices such as religion. So for example, there are some studies that argue that your religion in Western societies, particularly in the United States, could, quote unquote, be a backdoor to whiteness for some ethnic minority groups. So what that means is these ethnic groups may not be, quote unquote, white racially, but through religion, and so practicing a religion, especially a majority religion. So in a state, a majority religion would be Christianity, specifically being a Protestant, and then secondarily being a Catholic. And I said secondarily because I'm talking about percentage here. the number of Protestants, it's quite large in the United States, and then followed by a number of Catholics. And so Christian culture, Christian norms pervades, American life. And so one may wonder, right, let's say I'm Vietnamese and I am Catholic, right? So does that enables me to somehow enter, right, or attain some sort of white privileges or some sort of protection from my status as an ethnic minority? Right. I also look at my research also looked at ideas of racializations in Orientalism. So first of all, what is racialization? Racialization is when certain relationship, social practices, or certain groups that were previously not associated with race, but now it has been so. An example is racialization of different religions, such as being a Muslim, right? Is that what kind of race is associated with that, right? Being a Christian, what kind of race is usually associated with that, and being Buddhist, and so on, right? So supposedly most, not all, but most religions are pretty open to different ethnic and racial groups. But it's quite interesting that at the same time that many of these religions have this really global, universal orientation in accepting people of different ethnic groups, they're also racialized at the same time. And that could be internally, they're internally racializing their own religions, or externally, the religions are externally racialized by society, such as, for example, being a Muslim, right? What's the face of a Muslim, right? So how is Islam, which is a global religion, racialized, seen a certain way, right? So again, same thing with the other religions as well. So these are certain idea, theoretical frameworks which I'm trying to engage with in my research. So my project focuses on refugee groups. So it's a type of immigrants, but particularly, what distinguishes from refugees from other immigrants is that they're forced to leave their homeland. They're forced to go and resettle in somewhere else for fear of political or religious persecutions. And this category, refugees category, is only recently coined or classified by the UN after World War II, and increasingly much more so, of course, by the 60s as a result of the Cold War. That resulted in exodus of many Cold War refugees around the world. And so the aim of trying to recognize a particular group as refugees is that the receiving country would support these people to integrate or readapt, create their new lives, and not send them back to the country in which they fled from. So again, refugees, as you can see, is a very, it's a politically and of course culturally distinguished category from just being immigrants. Okay, so Viet Thanh Nguyen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and scholar. He teaches at USC, and I had the honor of working with him while I was a student there. So he said this: in the United States, it's un-American to be a refugee. A refugee embodies fear, failure, and flight. So how is that so? Well, refugees are often seen as being embodies trauma, right? Being forced to flee away from home. Of course, often they're poor because they have to flee, have to flee abruptly, right? They weren't prepared, and even if they were prepared, right, by the time they arrived in a place, they're extremely marginalized, right? And of course, they're seen as foreign. And so my project aims to recognize that reception of and construction of refugee, but I also want to move away from that and try to aim re-represent the refugees as a source of socio-legal object of knowledge, and that they themselves, right, their practices, their lives can present to us a term of memories and epistemologies, right, trying to understand how they construct their lives and perhaps resist this representation as being a damaged centered, this representation of them as being damaged, being poor, and so on. Okay? So my project really try to recognize and open up, conversations about how refugees themselves adapt to their new lives in their new countries and stay reconnected to each other around the world. So my way of entering these conversations about refugees is through Our Lady of Lavang. She is a Marian apparition. She appeared in Lavang, which is in central Vietnam. She appeared in 1798, according to oral traditions. She appeared to a group of Vietnamese Catholic refugees. In fact, they were fleeing away from Hue, the emperor, was nearby Lavang. And the emperor, Vietnamese emperor at that time, were not very nice to Catholics. In fact, he persecuted many of them, and this is why many Vietnamese refugees fled to Lavang. And so Lavang appeared to them in order to comfort them and protect them. So Catholicism was not fully accepted around this time, as you can see. But by the time the French had control over Vietnam, so it's about 100 years later, of course, Catholicism became much more tolerated under the French. And by the time there was a French bishop in Lavang, and what he did was he installed a European-looking, right, statue of Our Lady Lavang, as you can see here. And she's modeled after Our Lady of Victories in Paris. So what's interesting for me is to see that about 100 years later, after this European-looking Virgin Mary representation of Our Lady of Lavang was represented in Lavang, she became Vietnamese, right? And so I was really puzzled by this, right? She was European, and then now she's Asian. And in particular, her Asianization, or specifically Vietnamization, was initiated by Vietnamese Catholics in California, specifically Orange County, which has the largest number of Vietnamese outside Vietnam on a county level. On a city level, San Jose in the Bay Area has the largest number of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. So I was puzzled by this, right? Again, right? She was European, and then 100 years later, she became Vietnamese. I mean, what happened here? And how does that reflect, the lives of Vietnamese Catholics in the diaspora? So I'd like to stop here and start a new video.